Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 46, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. We are in the thick of zucchini season right now, although today it's a little bit overcast and showery, and I don't think that it's going to break 70 degrees. Right now it's in the mid-60s, and it feels pretty heavenly to me. I don't like hot weather. The 1 or 2 weeks every year that we get of 90 plus degree weather here in Montana just about does me in. So I'm always happy when things start to cool off and we start heading into cooler weather. And I know those of you who live in warmer climates are probably going to think I'm nuts, but like I said, I live in Montana for a reason. My husband and I were out in the yard the other morning and we saw our resident rabbit. We have a little bunny rabbit that lives here. And during the winter, he turns white, and during the summer, he turns brown. So we're always watching his colors changing. And we both looked at him and said to each other almost exactly at the same time, the bunny is starting to turn white. And it's only the middle of August, so I'm wondering if we are in for an extra snowy and cold winter. That seems to be the way the forecasts are leaning. Back in 1996-97, that winter, we had so much snow. People around here still refer to it as the year of the big snow. We had over 200 inches of snow here at our house, and so much snow was coming off the roof of the garage that the snow piles were high enough for the dogs to climb them and walk around on top of the garage roof. So we'll see if we're going to get that much snow here again. That year it started snowing on October 15th, and the last of the snow didn't melt until May 31st. And we were all happy to see it go. There was not a U-Haul to be found that spring because so many people who had moved up here decided that they couldn't take it. And they left for other areas. So I don't mind those kinds of winters every once in a while. It means a lot more sewing for me. It means a lot more snow plowing for my husband. And I think I get the better end of the deal. But we'll see what happens. I spent this past weekend sewing. I've been working on a lot of volunteer projects. And while I think that those community projects are important, I have to be careful that they don't start to take over my life because they will if I let them. And so I need to keep those boundaries in place. I worked on some volunteer projects on Friday morning and then I sewed on Friday afternoon. I sewed all day Saturday and I sewed yesterday afternoon again after church. I'm finishing up some projects. I've started 2 baby quilts that I need to get done soon. And I started working on the Harrelson bag. That's a noodle head pattern, and I'll put the link in the show notes. I have bought every pattern that Anna Graham has ever designed and released because her patterns are just that good. And I've made most of them. I hadn't yet made the Harrelson bag. It's kind of an elevated fanny pack, and it's been on my to-do list. It's been stalled for various reasons, and I finally gotten all the materials together, and I was watching the tutorial that Jess at Okla Roots, that's a YouTube channel, that Jess put out. Her bag tutorials are phenomenal. So if you haven't checked out her videos yet, do so. I will put a link to those in the show notes as well. For the exterior of that bag, I'm using waxed canvas from Klume House in Portland. And for the interior, I'm using some water-resistant canvas. I'm not thrilled with the water-resistant canvas, but I haven't used it before. And Jess at Okla Roots likes to use it and has talked about it, so I thought I would try it. The jury is still out. I'm trying to decide if I like it or not. So we'll see when the bag is done. I'm about halfway through. I have been sewing the exterior on my Juki 1541, my big industrial machine, because I want that machine to get some use, and I do enjoy sewing on it now that I've slowed the servo motor down enough that it's not running away from me. I sewed the interior, the lining pieces, on my Bernina 880, and I think I mentioned that I bought a used Bernina 880. Now that the Bernina 990 has come out, a lot of people in my area were trading in their 880s for a 990, and I was able to pick up an 880 for a really good price. I know that that machine has a bad rap. I know that people don't like it. I'm not having any trouble with it. It is a little persnickety about the bobbin threading, but once you figure out the little tricks to make that easier, I haven't had any issues. And every time I sit down at that machine, I find something else to love about it. So that's been a real pleasure to have that machine. I did outgrow my Janome 6600. That was a great machine for me at the time that I bought it. I think it's a great quilting and piecing machine, but the Bernina 880 just elevated my sewing to a whole new level. And I haven't even played around with the embroidery module yet, so we'll see what happens. We're going to jump in and do today's episode, which is an interview episode. I know I still have to do part 2 of the Presser Feet podcast, and I will. I think that's going to be next week. But I thought it was time for another interview, and I have a really fun one today. It's with a young man named Cornelius Quiring. He lives in Canada, and he's got a YouTube channel, and his YouTube channel is just delightful. Part of what drew me to his videos were, I'm a sewing nerd. I'm a sewing geek. There are things that I love about sewing that probably no one else finds interesting, but Cornelius has made some really fascinating videos, and the first one I watched was his video on the history of the seam gauge. And I was just blown away by the amount of research he did. He looked up patents for it. He explained what the different markings were. It was just fascinating to me. I went on from that one to watch his video on selvage denim. Also a great informative video with lots of historical data. And as we were chatting a bit before the recording, we found out that there is a Mennonite connection. He grew up in a Mennonite family and lived for part of his childhood in Paraguay. I have an acquaintance whose family also were missionaries in Paraguay, and so that's how we discovered the Mennonite connection. I belong to the Mennonite church here in Kalispell. I am the pianist there, and it's not what you think of as being a traditional Mennonite church. We belong to Mennonite Church USA, so it's a little bit more progressive. We ordain women and allow women to hold leadership positions, but the roots go back and eventually converge between all of the Mennonite groups and the Hutterites and the Brethren and lots of other groups like that. So I won't get into that because this is a sewing podcast and not a church podcast, but it was just really interesting to find that common connection. Cornelius and I had a great conversation, and toward the end of it, he turned the tables on me and asked me a few questions, and that was fun. So I hope that you will enjoy my visit with Cornelius Quiring. So I am here today with Cornelius Quiring, who has a YouTube channel, and I find his YouTube channel absolutely fascinating because I'm a bit of a sewing geek. So the first video that popped up was the one that you did on the history of the seam gauge and the patent exploration that you did and talking about how that evolved. And so I was hooked from that moment. So we're going to have a conversation with Cornelius about his sewing and his YouTube channel and anything else that strikes our fancy. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I always start out my interviews by asking my guests how they learned to sew. And did someone teach you?
I learned the very basics from my mom. And then in high school, I took a sewing class and I learned some basics there. But I think the bulk of what I've learned has been a combination of a whole bunch of mistakes and trial and error and just random YouTube tutorials and blogs I found online.
I think YouTube is one of the most wonderful things ever, because it doesn't matter what question you have, you can go to YouTube and usually find a tutorial.
It's amazing how niche some of the stuff is too. like just down to
Absolutely.
the very smallest little detail that maybe five other people have wondered about. But luckily, someone was kind enough to record a little bit, and it helps to spread the information.
So you sew a lot of your own clothing.
I do, yes. I make everything at this point. Well, I should say I make all the outside clothes. I don't make shoes yet, but I would like to do that eventually. But tops, pants, I've made some coats, just about everything at this point.
Do you remember the first project you made for yourself?
The first full project that I finished was in high school. I had made a pair of capri pants because they were quite in at the time, rather baggy as well. And wanting to be stylish, I did a bright yellow top stitching on a black pant.
If you were in the United States, we would say that you were a Steelers fan.
Oh, true. Yeah, those are
Black and yellow are Steelers colors. So how did they fit? Did
okay.
you wear them?
I think I wore them for about 2 hours after I made them. I had put them on. I was walking around school with them, and it was it seemed like an interesting idea when I was making them until I put them on and saw them in a mirror, and I realized that perhaps the bright yellow wasn't quite the beauty I had envisioned. And I think they became rags after that.
But obviously you weren't deterred.
No, not at all. I enjoyed making things. So the making itself has always been a joy for me, but those particular pair didn't make it very far.
So can you talk a little bit more about your journey from maybe those pants to where you are now?
Yeah, it started off there. I also then wanted to make my own t-shirts with a V-neck specifically and long sleeve, and I couldn't find what I wanted. It was also my first time sewing stretchy fabrics. And so that was a project that mom and I did together. She walked me through the basics of it and turned out quite well. I had those for many years, actually. So project number two was a little bit better. From there, it was a little bit more off and on here and there. And then when I graduated from college, I started to get into it a bit more. I bought a machine of my own. I wasn't using mom's anymore. And so then I made bright red pants. I made some bright yellow pants. As you can see, I was a fan of color early on. I wanted something vibrant. I remember them specifically because of how vivid in color they were.
Did you study textiles in college?
No, I studied graphic design. So it was vaguely related, the world of art, I guess, and making and visual design. Pattern drafting has been something that I've learned on my own. It's been a real patchwork of just pasting together knowledge that I can find to figure out how all this stuff works.
I'm glad you brought that up. Pattern drafting has been a journey for me too. I
Oh
was a
yeah.
knitting designer for 16 years, and so I understand pattern drafting of knitted garments, but then when I moved over to sewing, it was a whole nother ball of wax. And as you say, it's getting things piecemeal, which can be really frustrating. So where did you start that pattern drafting journey? Was it with your tops?
Yeah, it was, well, I wanted to make more t-shirts after that, but I realized that if I'm going to be making my own clothes, I can of course make them fit exactly how I want. I don't have to do just pre-made patterns. And so I wanted to make t-shirts that uniquely fit my body for the difference between the two sides. And so it just started out of that need of wanting to learn how to make an actual pattern that is asymmetrical. And so from there, I found, I believe it was a blog that I found that had a series of instructions written out and followed along with that and then tried to adjust for my own needs.
It's a lot of trial and error.
It is. I recall not being able to put it over my head because the neck was too tight and too small.
We've all been there.
It's also learned that a woven fabric does not function the same as a knit fabric. So I had to
That
cut a slit down the front just to slide it over top.
so did you like working with knits? Do you prefer working with wovens?
I find I like both of them. I really don't even have a favorite. They present slightly different challenges, but to me, I find all fabric, especially with how many options you get these days, you can get blends of different fabrics. And then you have knits that even have elastic in them. That functions very different than just a straightforward cotton knit does. So for me, either or really. But to be fair, I think for me, what I prefer is cotton. That's what I've realized. Less the how it's made and more what the yarn itself is.
So you like the natural fibers?
I do. Yeah, I find cotton is the best. I have relatively sensitive skin, so even linen I just find is too itchy. Not a fan of the polyesters.
No, they don't breathe very well.
No. Somehow you are both cold and sweat at the same time.
Yeah. Your aesthetic has changed a little bit, I guess, from the bright colors because it seems now you're more in the neutrals. Has that been the evolution?
Yeah, you've picked up on a good point there. Today, my closet is exclusively black and white. I realize that I like to look at bright, colorful things, but I don't necessarily want to wear them. I had the realization that one garment that I always feel good in is a black pair of pants and a white shirt. No matter how I'm feeling that day, I feel good in that. And so I realized, like, why am I creating all these different items when I know what works? And so from there, I've started just paring back until that's all I wear now.
That is so important. I think developing your own personal style. So I no one can see us because we're doing this is an audio podcast, but you and I are on video right now, and I've got on a bright purple t-shirt because
Yeah.
I'm kind of a parrot. I love the bright colors. And you're right, it's what you feel good in. So learning to develop that personal style, I think, is really important.
I was going to say it makes a difference in how we feel every day if we understand what we like. And I feel like it just makes the day just a bit better
Yeah,
wearing what we
definitely.
like.
So you don't shy away from complicated projects. You make button-down shirts and you make jeans and you make pants and not only do you make them, but you draft them yourself. So it seems like you've maybe conquered the drafting skills and you're teaching a drafting class too. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think to me, I want to make my own clothes. And the idea of making it was to make them uniquely fit my body. For a little bit of context, I was in a farm accident when I was 3 years old. And as a result of that accident, the right side of my body, some of the muscle groups haven't developed. So my right arm is noticeably thinner than the left. And there's a couple other things like that. But that was sort of the impetus of wanting to draft my own clothes. And I feel like if I'm going to be making them, then I also want the fit to be unique as well. Like I think commercial patterns are great. It allows people to express themselves with different colors and patterns. I just want to take it one step further. Like, let me really make it myself from the ground up with a unique pattern. And so, from very early on, when I started making clothes, that was an interest of mine as well. And I have since sort of cobbled together enough bits of information to figure out how it works. And I think the big challenge was learning how to turn 2D shapes into 3D shapes. And I really struggled to find cohesive information online when I was learning. And so I realized that it was a thing I wanted early on. I couldn't find what I needed. And so let me share that knowledge with others. I like to put out there how I like to think about it. Because I know there's books about pattern drafting, but I've always struggled to comprehend information in written form. I like to see it a little bit more. If possible, touch and hold it makes a big difference. And so I think that's also why I gravitated towards making videos about it. is it allows me to demonstrate the different shapes and what they do, as opposed to using the written word. And so my aim is to hopefully create a little more available, cohesive knowledge out there for others to also, if they're interested, draft clothes uniquely tailored to fit them.
In my own fitting journey, I was really struggling with pants and skirts. And I had
Okay.
an epiphany one day after someone took my measurements and she said, the widest part of your hip is not 9 inches below your waistline. It's only 5 inches below your waistline. I've got what, if you look in some of the fitting books or some of the fitting resources online, I have what's called a figure 8 body. I have a very high hip
Okay.
curve. And it was like
Okay.
mind blowing once I figured that out, because I was like, now I know why A-line skirts don't fit. Now I know why, I have to adjust that
Hmm.
part of the pattern for myself. So, but there was nothing, as you say, there was nothing in the literature that said, hey, look out for this. So some things
Hmm.
you stumble upon accidentally and then have to
I find,
incorporate into your practice. When it comes to pattern drafting, do you prefer doing it like hands-on with paper and pencil, or do you do any drafting on the computer? What's your favorite way to?
oh yeah, it's all done with paper and pencil. I find that it's such a tactile thing to produce. And ultimately, it's being made by hand, anyways, once the garment is sewn. And so to do it on paper, to me, feels more connected to the process. There's something detached about doing things on screen. And I think that's largely because it doesn't represent the accurate sizing, right? Like a screen is just not going to be able to be large enough to show like a full pant leg at full size. And being able to do it with pencil and paper allows you to see what you're actually making. I'm sure with time, I could get to a place of doing it online, but I've actively made the choice not to digitize the process because that pencil and paper process helps me to see what I'm doing in the moment and have an understanding of, okay, is this going to fit? Is it not going to fit? Does it look too big or small?
But you still make muslins, I bet.
Oh, yeah, I make samples out of everything and at least three or four. I never get it right the first time. I've given up on the idea of being able to nail it.
So, can you talk a little bit about your inspiration for starting your YouTube channel? I know you said that you'd like to share the information that you're finding and maybe keep people from having to reinvent the wheel.
It's a combination of two things, really. I've always enjoyed entertaining and growing up, did plays in school and local community theater. And so I have that natural desire to perform, but I also needed an outlet that was easily accessible, that I could have access to, and combine that with the fact that I've always just made things my whole life. I was making go-karts as a little boy, making different things out of wood and stuff. And so it was a natural combination of, well, I have easy access here. I have full control by posting it online. I get to make things and I get to entertain in the process. So it's a bit of a soup of all those things that ended up coming together for the reason why I do it.
Your videos are very entertaining, and I know you did do a video about kind of behind the scenes. I'm probably just spitballing here, but people maybe don't understand that you don't just film what you're doing, that sometimes you have to do extra steps to demonstrate something when you're doing a video. So you're not just videoing yourself sewing from start to finish.
Oh yeah, it's definitely if you were to see how it's done, how the soup is made, it's quite the process. Like I'll often film something twice, so there might be a way, sort of a zoomed out version of me talking about something, but then I'll redo it again, going closer in to do a nice tight shot to be able to better see what I'm doing. Other times I mess up what I'm saying and then I have to re-record the audio for that while I'm editing it together. So it's a real process of putting things together. It's not what you see is not what it looks like in the making process.
and it's a creative practice in itself, making the videos, just as much as sewing is, I would imagine.
Oh yeah, it's a full craft unto itself that has to be learned. Learning how to frame a shot, making sure to get the lighting correct, and then editing, learning the software as well, all those sorts of things. So that's quite a skill set unto itself that has to be learned in order to be able to put it together.
Well, I think you've done it well.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
What sewing machine do you sew on? I'm curious.
In terms of machines, I like just a classic standard machine without any of the modern electronics on it. The mechanical machines that are simple to fix, because I find it's, for me at least, if I can fix it, I can understand it. And so little things like adjusting the timing if it's off, the zigzags, stitches are skipping, that kind of stuff allows me to get in there and understand what I'm doing.
I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction now. You're doing videos about making clothes for guys. And honestly, there just aren't a lot of channels out there that are aimed at the male half of the population that wants to make their own clothing. Do you have any sense of who your viewers are? And do you think that you're filling that niche there?
It's interesting. My audience kind of changes with time. And so it started out as a predominantly male audience. It was about 70% men, 30% women. And that has now evened out to about 50-50. And it has actually, the biggest change has now been my audience has skewed a little bit older. And so I now have in the 50 plus bracket, the women in their 50s and older have lately discovered what I put out there and has actually been the largest demographic that has grown for my content, which is it's been interesting to see how it's evolved with time, who's discovered what I'm doing and is taking an interest.
I'm laughing because I'm in that demographic.
Well, I mean, clearly it must be working because we're doing this podcast now.
Yeah, absolutely. But even watching you make a pair of pants for a man, it's not so much who you're making them for, it's the process. And I think that there's always something that you can apply to your own process, even if the subject matter isn't specifically aimed at you.
Oh yeah, I find the techniques go are available or can be used by basically anyone for just about everything they want to make. Like just about every garment can use a dart or a pleat, right? And so these sorts of things end up going all over the place. And interestingly, what I'm finding is I'm finding more women are interested in my content specifically for the purposes of creating it for their male partners often. And so I think that's part of the reason why it's also balanced out to more of a 50-50 audience.
That's
A lot
interesting.
of lucky guys out there
I'll
getting things
say.
made for them. Yeah.
Do you teach locally at all?
No, right now I do everything online. I find that it's a bit more of a niche space that I'm in. I think I read somewhere that it was 90% of sewing is done by women and 10% is men, or maybe 80-20, something like that. And so naturally being a guy, that makes a smaller fraction, and then doing it locally as well. It also requires me to have a space to be able to do it. And so my focus is online. It allows me to have a broader audience in that sense. And it's been amazing. I've been getting messages from people all over the world from the most interesting places who have watched and used some technique from one of my videos.
What do you think you'll be doing in the future?
I want to try making shoes. I think that's a skill set I'd like to get into, like doing leather work specifically. For me, it'd be shoes because I've done. No, I will never say I've mastered clothes because the more I learn, the more I realize there is to learn. But I'd like to broaden that to more heavier fabrics like leather and then making shoes. And it feels like there's a different skill set there that is adjacent to what I do, but would add to it. And it would allow me to just make the shoes I've always dreamed of.
I make bags, but I can't imagine making shoes. So we'll have you back on the podcast when you've mastered making shoes,
I saw someone else do it and I figured, you know what? If others can do it, I can do it too.
right? There you go.
The first few pairs probably won't see the light of day, but there's always
Yeah.
a bit of learning that has to happen.
You're online not only on YouTube. Do you have an Instagram account, and can you maybe talk a little bit about your other social media channels?
Yeah, I do Instagram and TikTok. I post the same thing to both of them. And interestingly, that has actually become my biggest audience beyond YouTube. And so my focus on that platform is I'm limited to a minute and a half on Instagram. So I do little snippets, little tips and tricks that can be cut down to a minute and a half or less. So little things like how to shorten a zipper was a recent one I did. A quick brief on needle types for machines, those sorts of things.
And I will make sure that I list all of those in the show notes so that we have them.
Well, I appreciate it. Speaking of audiences, I find
Yeah.
it's also interesting how these different platforms have different audiences. And so Instagram, for example, is a very North American centric audience. And then TikTok is a much more international audience. And the age groups vary between the two. Instagram, I actually have, I think, two-thirds are women and then a third men. And so these different platforms have different groups of people interested in what I do. So I get to sort of talk to different segments of people.
That's very cool that you're analyzing who your audience is and what platforms they're using. I admit to great frustration with Instagram, and
Oh
maybe
yeah.
it's my
What are your
age.
challenges? What are you struggling with on Instagram?
I don't like working on my phone, for one thing.
Oh,
And
okay.
I do have it set up on my computer so that my computer thinks it's a phone to post to Instagram. There's a way to use Apple developer tools to do that, but it's still kind of clunky.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'm working my way through it, but it's been a frustration.
I make all my videos on the computer and then I upload them like that. So I don't actually do any of the editing on the phone and stuff. I
No,
also don't like the editing tools that they have built in. It sort of pigeonholes a little bit, I find. And so yeah, I edit all on my computer here and upload the finalized video file.
what are you using for editing?
I use Adobe Premiere,
Mm-hmm.
but I use the whole suite of products, so a bit of Photoshop and Illustrator as well
Sure.
for the graphics.
Would you ever have any interest in designing sewing patterns for sale?
I no, no, I don't. I find there's a lot of patterns available out there already. I candidly have never used, or I should say, beyond one or two when I first started, I haven't used patterns. I've always just drafted my own, no matter how bad they looked in the beginning. And so I have an understanding of pattern drafting. And so it just feels more authentic to me to focus on sharing my pattern drafting skills than to make patterns themselves. My aim is to encourage people to discover that pattern drafting isn't, well, correction, pattern drafting is difficult, but it's very learnable. And with enough practice, it sort of becomes fairly manageable. And there's a learning of like, oh, yeah, there's just like, I like to say pattern drafting is squares, triangles, and circles. And you're just putting those three shapes together and making them slightly more complex as you go until you end up with a shirt or a pant pattern.
I tell people I'm very spatially challenged. So I
Okay.
love math, but it's the shapes that sometimes get me.
It's definitely requires a bit of a leap going from the flat piece of paper to a 3D shape on the body. And then just for a little bit more complexity, fabric, of course, also isn't rigid. So it's a little harder to see how it translates and what is causing the fit issues.
Sure.
If it wasn't easy, would we be doing it, you know?
Exactly, exactly. Well, is there anything we haven't talked about that you want to talk about?
I think that covers just about everything. I think I just appreciate you taking the time to actually want to have a conversation with me.
Oh,
I
sure.
find it's such a it can be quite a one-way conversation on just posting all the time. I get comments, which is fantastic, and I get to engage that way, but for the most part, I'm just by myself staring into a lens and then watching myself as I edit back, and so it can become quite insular. So it's nice to finally be able to talk about this craft that we all do with someone else who enjoys it. If I could ask you some questions, though, that'd be nice.
Sure, you can ask me some questions.
You'd mentioned earlier about going from knitting to sewing, and so I was wondering what you found the difference was from patterning for knits to garments.
That's a great question. When I would sit down to design a sweater pattern, I had this book in college called All Sweaters in Every Gauge. And it was basically a workbook that you would knit a gauge swatch. Do you knit at all? Do you understand how that
I do
works?
not know.
So
Yeah, unfortunately not.
when you knit a piece of fabric, it's comprised of stitches, and you have so many stitches per inch, depending on how thick or
Okay.
thin the yarn is. So you
Okay.
start out by knitting a gauge swatch, and that tells you, let's say that you have 5 stitches per inch. So then you take the body measurement and you figure out how many stitches you have to cast onto your needles at 5 stitches per inch to get 40 inches around, say. So you do that math, and then you have to do not only the circumference, but you've also got to do the length. And then, as you say, it's triangles and circles and things like that. So, when you're shaping your arm side, you have to figure out what your rate of decreases needs to be. So you're taking stitches out of the fabric. And ultimately, I did everything in a spreadsheet because
Oh,
not
wow.
only was I doing Excel and I are good friends. Not only are you doing one size, I would do the size that I made for myself, but then you have to grade up and down. And to do that, you plug all the numbers into a spreadsheet and do all the formulas and then just, calculate everything for each size. So it's a little bit different than drafting with fabric, with actual fabric that's already in existence, because when you're knitting a sweater, you're creating the fabric.
That makes garment drafting suddenly seem so much easier than, than what you've been doing. Must have been like a breeze going from what you were over to garments.
And see, I thought drafting for knitting patterns was fairly easy, and then I got into drafting for sewing, and it was just like I had been transported to a completely different country with a completely different
Oh, wow.
language. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. Do you find that there was anything that was transferable though in terms of the skills that you'd picked up there that
Absolutely. Sleeve cap shaping. I had a good understanding of sleeve cap shaping and how a sleeve cap fits into an arm side. So that transferred pretty easily.
that one's always I find a little challenging for people is to learn the shape of the sleeve cap, but once you get a handle of it, so good to hear that that one was able to be transferred over.
Yeah,
One other question is I noticed that you have some fiber related things that you mentioned doing. Do you sort of harvest the r- raw, what are they called? The staples and turn it into the actual yarn itself?
I do. I am a hand spinner, although I haven't done it in a long time. I did that maybe 30 years ago. I knit a lot when I was in college, and then that was learning how to spin was kind of a natural extension of that. And we were living in Pennsylvania at the time, surrounded by a lot of sheep farms. So I learned how
Oh,
to
okay.
spin wool. And then I learned how to spin cotton, and I spin hemp, and I spin linen, and I've spun, silk, all of the fibers. And that also has been, that knowledge has transferred really well in terms of knowing about sewing thread. And I actually do teach a class specifically on nothing but sewing thread. Having learned all of that, that's helpful too.
That is very impressive. Have you, I'm assuming you've then turned that into an actual knitted garment itself.
I did. I knit a lot of my hand spun. It's funny because one of the fibers that I really, really love to spin is hemp. I made myself a hemp vest. I knitted a hemp vest and I was wearing it in town one day and a lady came up and tried to buy it off of me. And
Oh,
she off
wow.
she offered me she upped the ante several times, but I didn't want to sell it. I've still got it.
I can
So,
imagine the amount of effort required. I feel like I do a lot of work making my own patterns and sewing clothes, but to actually spin the yarn, that is hats off to you. That is impressive.
oh, thanks. But there's a reason I don't do it very much anymore because it is pretty time consuming.
I can imagine. I've watched some videos online of folks spinning some of their own yarn, and I the patience required is amazing.
I have a good friend that lives here who's also a hand spinner, and she's actually written a book, and she's growing cotton this year to see if she can get it to
Wow.
grow here. She's got it in pots. And so every couple of days she'll send me pictures and she'll say, "Look, here's the cotton. It's starting to form a cotton ball." And so that's
Oh,
been
that's
fun.
amazing.
Yeah,
Wow.
but
If only I had $1 million, I would love to spend my time doing every step of the process. That is so fascinating.
so any other
I mean,
questions?
no, that was mainly it. I was just fascinated to hear about a bit more about what you've done.
Well, if you ever take up knitting, you will have that pattern drafting experience.
Oh, I'm trying my best not to pick up any other skill sets. It's already too much.
Right, right.
There's too many things that seem interesting, intriguing. I can't. I'll get too distracted.
What are you working on right now?
Reworking my wardrobe, really. I've with time, we all tend to change shapes and sizes, and so I'm just slowly morphing my closet to some new pieces that fit better and just different profiles and designs. So I'm very selfish. I'm very selfish. I only want to sew for myself.
There's nothing wrong with that.
I've learned to just be honest about it that it's a personal interest I want to make for myself and then I like to share what I learned, which is the content I put out there.
Well, I'm glad you started a YouTube channel.
Well, and thank you for watching it. I'm happy to hear it.
Well, I think we will wrap this up. We've had a great conversation and I do look forward to having you back on. So, is there anything else you want to mention?
No, that would be it. Just thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Cornelius, and I hope that you will go check out his YouTube channel. He's got a lot of great content there, and you will learn and be entertained at the same time. Thank you for the feedback that I've been getting. I did get a question about would I ever do video, and the answer right now is probably no. If you listen to this interview, you heard Cornelius talk a little bit about what's involved in editing video, and I am just not set up well to do any kind of video. That when we built our house, we didn't consider lighting very well because that was almost 30 years ago and I had no idea that video would become a thing. So it's a little dark in my house. I'd have to get special lighting. I'd have to redo my office a bit for a better backdrop, and I'd have to wear makeup, which is not something that I tend to do unless I'm teaching. So there are a lot of reasons why. I also don't want to have to learn another editing program. It takes me a good hour to 2 hours to edit the podcast every week, and to throw video in on top of that would probably send me around the bend. So I'm not ruling it out, and I appreciate the request, but for now, the podcast will be audio only. If you'd like to give feedback, there is the fan mail option through Buzzsprout, my podcast hosting company. That shows up as a link on Apple Podcasts. You're welcome to send me fan mail through the fan mail link. I can't respond directly to that feedback though. So if you would like a response, the best way to get a hold of me is to email me at janet@janetzabo.com. That's my website at www.janetzabo.com. My blog is there where I post 3 or 4 times a week. That's where you can see pictures of my sewing projects, my garden, other things that are going on here in Montana. There's a link to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website. The show notes for each episode can be found on the show website, and that's at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. And you can also leave comments there. So I look forward to hearing from you. I appreciate the feedback. I appreciate the reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So until our next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.